Another part of the investigation that's interesting to me is the identification of other suspects and the media exposure. Now, several suspects were identified over the years. We've primarily traced them since 2005 when the task force was reactivated. But we do know, in February of 1977, the Oakland County prosecutor went public in the Detroit News and the Daily Tribune and said that Busch had been polygraphed, he'd passed the polygraph, and he was cleared in the Mark Stebbins murder. Then, in 1999, the name David Norberg came up in public. He was originally a suspect in the case, but he was cleared in 1981 when his wife gave him some alibis. Well, he was cleared earlier. He died in 1981 in an automobile accident, and it's my understanding that the wife withdrew her alibis for her deceased husband. And he had in his possession a piece of jewelry which the Mihalik family identified as coming from Kristine. And they decided to go out to Wyoming, I think it was, might have been Utah, it's one of those mountain states, and exhume his body to see if it matched, his DNA matched a hair found on Timmy's body. And I recall at the time writing a letter to both Brooks Patterson, then the Oakland County Executive, and to Matty Maroon, the owner of the Ambassador Bridge, who volunteered an airplane to take them out to exhume the body, and thanking them for that. The condition of the Norberg investigation also came to the attention of my children, and Kathy found a book published by the Michigan State Police, Preserve, Protect, and Defend. And this is what the Michigan State Police had to say about that Norberg investigation. The case will be considered solved if the results match DNA evidence from a single strand of hair found in 1977 on the body of 11-year-old Timothy King of Birmingham, Michigan, the last of the victims, end quote. We have a match between Gunnels and one of the victims, Kristine Mihalik, and nobody wants to pay any attention to that. If they have a match between Norberg and Tim, the case is solved. Somebody should explain that to me. But that was the lead in 1999. In 2005, the task force was reactivated. We've told you about that. They had some new evidence, and they were going to check into seeing if they could solve the case. In 2006, there were newspaper reports from the Michigan State Police saying that they had a suspect named Todd Warszecha who was in Texas. But before they could interview him, he committed suicide. Interestingly enough, the Michigan State Police told the media at the time that this suicide might have be possible involvement in the case. Busch commits suicide, there's no publicity. Warszecha commits suicide, it's possible involvement. Then in 2006, a Richard Raar, R-A-A-R, was arrested on alleged pedophile activity and said that he was being considered a suspect in the Oakland County child killings. Mr. Raar has written to both Kathy and me. He's upset with being in prison, and I don't know whether he has any information on the Oakland County child killings or not, but in his recent letter to Kathy, he said that because of all the hullabaloo he'd been stirring up, they had transferred him from a prison near his home in the Lower Peninsula to the Kinross facility in the Upper Peninsula, and that his wife could no longer visit him. I hope somebody's talked to Mr. Raar and find out if he does have any information. And whether he has any contact with anybody in prison who may have some information on this. That's been inferred to me. And we have Theodore Lamborgine. And we've told you about him. He was arrested in Parma, Ohio, a participant in the Cass Avenue pedophile ring, and flunked a lie detector test about the Oakland County child killings. And we have another suspect identified last year, Arch Sloan. And we've discussed Mr. Sloan in other places in this presentation. But he was identified publicly by law enforcement in July of 2012. And Jessica Cooper, the Oakland County prosecutor, said they found hairs on Mark Stebbins and my son, which matched a hair found in Mr. Sloan's Bonneville automobile. However, the hair in the car did not match Mr. Sloan. I've been told that Mr. Sloan didn't know that till after Ms. Cooper went public, but again, somebody's going to have to ask Mr. Sloan and Ms. Cooper about that. In July of 2011, Prosecutor Cooper told me she had live suspects, and that was encouraging to me. When I got the Sloan report, I was kind of confused because she didn't seem to know who the suspect was, and if you don't know who he is, how do you know if he's alive or dead? But as I told you earlier in the grand jury proceedings, she was able to contain convictions in 2 other cold cases. And she was quoted in the paper as saying that she was able to convict them on circumstantial evidence. Then we get to the Oakland County child killer case, and she says she needs scientific evidence. And we've told you the investigators believe there was enough circumstantial evidence to charge Busch if he was alive. Again, people should talk out of one side of their mouth. If circumstantial evidence is appropriate in murder cases, it should be appropriate in all of them. And similarly, scientific evidence should be available in all cases if it's there. Now, when Cooper went public in July with this information on Arch Sloan, both Brooks Patterson and Kim Worthy were very angry. They said when you're looking for a suspect, you just don't tell people who you're looking for. And of course, I have no experience in that area, and I can't pass judgment on that. And I'll also remind you at this time, in this presentation, when I talk about Lieutenant Gary Miller of the Oakland County Sheriff's Office, he told me that the idea of going public with the Sloan information was really that of the police people and not the prosecutor. Once this information became available to me, I did a little homework, and I believe in my heart of hearts that Sloan information was available to Prosecutor Cooper on March the 1st, 2010, when she told me Busch was not involved. I need confirmation from somebody about that. But if true, that means they've been looking at the Sloan case for 3 years and haven't found anything. And if they did find some information from the hairs they found on Mark Stebbins and Tim, it was the result of Kim Worthy's constant nagging for additional trace evidence information on the Oakland County child killer case. That trace evidence was in a lot of places, and most of it was sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico for examination. So if the Sloan information came up from the trace evidence which they found in these remote places, it was primarily the result of Miss Worthy's insistence and not anybody else's. And I have a little trouble making a distinction between Busch and Gunnels and Sloan and his passenger. In both cases, we have trace evidence found on a victim. And there's a DNA match between the victim and the suspect. In the Sloan case, we don't know who it is, unknown suspect. In the Busch case, it's Gunnels. And we also know that the DNA match is not between the driver of the automobile, Sloan or Busch, and the victim. It's all the same to me, except in the Sloan case, they've got from 2 victims instead of 1. But it's the same path. And if Gunnels was ruled out by Miss Cooper in March the 1st, 2009, she's got to also outlawed on the Sloan case. And all I've wanted from Miss Cooper and the other law enforcement officials is an explanation why on March the 1st, 2010, they excluded Busch and Gunnels. Now, the interesting part of all of these cases, suspects that I've talked about in this part of the presentation, is that the law enforcement went public. It wasn't somebody else going public. In our case, the publicity came from the victim's family, mine, when Marnie Keenan published her articles on October 27, 2009. And at that point in time, the law enforcement people thought that was the most viable suspect they'd ever looked at. Now, why they don't go public on Busch, you leave to conjecture. But if I was in law enforcement, I wouldn't want to explain to anybody why a 4-time convicted pedophile never spent a day in jail, why a 4-time convicted pedophile was granted probation and put back on the street to possibly abuse other boys, including my son, and why the file was as messed up as it was. But there certainly is an inconsistent position from law enforcement on the Busch case as opposed to all of these other suspects who've all been shunted aside. There was also another suspect made the headlines last year, and this one was not through law enforcement, it was through Deborah Jarvis, the mother of Kristine Mihalik. She filed a lawsuit in federal court asking that the investigation be turned over to the Department of Justice and that she be awarded $100 million. And that went public when her attorney announced the filing of the lawsuit. And the basis of the lawsuit was that a gentleman named Bob had solved the case. Not only this case, but some other children's murders cases in Michigan and others outside of the state. And all he needed was a handwritten letter or note which he believed was in the Oakland County prosecutor's file, and which the Oakland County prosecutor told him he couldn't have. And Mr. Hughes also acknowledged that he had never met Bob and was relying on statements made to him by Deborah Jarvis and by Bob over the telephone. The only time Mr. Waltons ever talked to me in the courtroom was April the 25th, 2012, when Lisa and I were talking about Bob, and he came over and asked me if I knew who Bob was. I told him I hadn't the slightest idea. I didn't know how to blog then. I don't know how to blog now. But I said I will check with my children and see if they can be helpful to you. And they gave me some insight into who they thought it might or might not be. When I tried to call Mr. Walton with that information, the operator, he would not accept my call. When I told the operator why I was calling, he would not accept my call. And so I just stopped any attempt to confer with them on that subject. And then several weeks after that, there was an announcement in the paper that Bob had solved the case by the use of astrology, an investigative procedure that I'm not familiar with. And I had received one of those 3-inch Federal Express packages, about half full of papers, from a gentleman who'd similarly solved the case by astrology. And my legal assistant, Janie Chenard, gets the computer out and does her magic and finds that I had written a letter to the gentleman who had provided that information to me. It was dated December 28, 2009. I told this gentleman that I had delivered the papers to the Michigan State Police, gave him Sergeant Gray's phone number, told him how to get hold of him, and thanked him for his interest. And I made that information available to Lieutenant Miller, Lieutenant Powell, and Corey Williams. Now, I don't know whether any use was made of that information, but it's another indication of the one-way street. I provide information to law enforcement, and it stays there. The defendants in that lawsuit were the Oakland County prosecutor, the Michigan State Police, and several personnel in those agencies. They filed motions to dismiss the lawsuit. That motion was heard last September 2012, and in late March this year, 2013, the judge dismissed the case, and Paul Hughes has told me that he is not taking an appeal. But in summary, law enforcement, in all the instances I've talked about, except Busch and Bob, goes public, saying we're working hard, we got suspects, we need your help, and they don't do that on Busch. Is there a reason? How do I know? I'd like them to explain it to me.